There is a specific quality to the pain of twin flame separation that most people struggle to name accurately. It is not quite grief. Grief, as devastating as it is, has a kind of clarity to it. You know what you lost. You can point to it. You can build a story around the absence, and that story, however painful, holds you. But this is different. The person is gone, or the connection has gone quiet, and yet the feeling is not entirely about them. There is something else underneath it, something closer, something that has to do not with their absence, but with the strange, unsettling porousness of your own edges. You reach for the version of yourself that existed before this connection and find that it does not quite fit anymore. Something that felt solid has gone soft. Something you relied on without knowing you relied on. It is no longer reliably there. This video is about what that actually is, not as a wound, as a process, one that contemplatives and depth psychologists have been mapping for centuries. Let us stay with the experience itself before we name it. In the early period of separation, most people report something they describe as not feeling like themselves. This phrase gets used so often that it loses its precision. But if you slow it down and examine what it actually means, it points towards something quite specific. Before this connection, you had a working sense of who you were. Not a perfect or fully examined sense, but a functional one. You knew your rhythms, your preferences, your reflexes. You knew how you moved through the world, and roughly what the world could be expected to return to you. That knowing was quiet and largely unconscious, the way the ground under your feet is quiet. You did not think about it because you did not need to. Then this connection arrived, and in its wake, or in the wake of its absence, that quiet ground is no longer quiet. It has become a question. The things you were certain of about yourself are now uncertain. The ways you understood your own needs, your own boundaries, your own capacity for feeling, all of it has been disturbed at a level that your ordinary coping strategies cannot quite reach. You may find that the self-narratives you lived inside comfortably before, the stories about what you deserve, about how relationships work, about what you are capable of feeling, no longer fit the person who is sitting here now on the other side of this experience. And the pain of separation, underneath the longing for the person, underneath the grief of the specific loss, has this quality. It is the pain of a self that is no longer holding its previous shape. That is a precise description, and it deserves a precise framework. In the 16th century, a Spanish mystic named John of the Cross wrote about an experience he called the dark night of the soul. This phrase has been so thoroughly borrowed and diluted by contemporary spiritual culture that almost nothing of its original precision remains. So it is worth returning to what he actually described. John was not talking about a period of sadness or difficulty. He was describing a specific structural event in the interior life, a process in which the self that has been constructed around its familiar consolations, its known ways of finding meaning, its reliable sense of its own spiritual or psychological identity, is systematically stripped of those supports, not as punishment, as preparation. He observed that what feels like abandonment, what feels like the withdrawal of everything that made the self feel coherent and oriented, is precisely the mechanism through which a deeper, less defended, less performed version of the self becomes possible. The constructed self, what depth psychology would later call the ego or the false self, is not evil. It was necessary. It was built in response to real conditions. It learned its shape through experience, through what was rewarded and what was punished, through what was safe to feel and what was not. It was, for a long time, genuinely useful. But it has limits, and those limits become visible only when the constructed self is placed under a specific kind of pressure. The kind of pressure that the twin flame connection, with its extraordinary intensity and its refusal to resolve itself into ordinary relational patterns, applies with unusual force. Across contemplative traditions, this process carries different names. In Sufi mysticism, it is called Fana, which translates approximately as annihilation, not the destruction of the person, but the dissolution of the false self that stands between the person and a more direct experience of their own nature. In Zen, it appears in the concept of the great death, the dying away of the conceptual self before what practitioners call the great life can be inhabited. What is striking when you read these traditions carefully is how consistently they describe the phenomenology, the loss of familiar orientation, the feeling that the ground has gone, the inability to locate yourself inside the stories and roles that previously felt like home, the specific terror of a self that does not know what it is anymore. This is not pathology. It is a recognized and mapped passage. James Hollis, a Jungian analyst, writes about what he calls the provisional personality, the self that is assembled in the first half of life to meet the demands of survival, belonging, and social function. This provisional self is not the whole person. It is the person as they have learned to perform themselves under the conditions they were given. The twin flame encounter has a way of revealing the provisional nature of that personality with unusual clarity and unusual force, not because the other person intends this, but because the intensity of the connection and the specific quality of its disruptions, its arrivals and departures, its capacity to produce states that the ordinary self has no existing strategy for managing, places demands on the constructed self that it genuinely cannot meet. And when a self that has been sufficient for everything encounters something it cannot manage, it begins to loosen. That loosening is what separation feels like from the inside. So what does this ask of you in practical terms? In the ordinary days of separation, when the pain is present, and the person is absent, and the self feels unreliable, the first thing it asks is a reorientation of attention, not from the other person toward yourself in a way that is merely compensatory, a way of managing the loss by redirecting focus, but a genuine turning of inquiry toward what specifically is loosening and what that loosening is revealing. Because the dissolution is not random. It does not take everything. It takes the parts of the constructed self that were never fully yours to begin with, the identities that were assembled in response to other people's needs, the self-concepts that were built on conditions that no longer apply, the stories about love and worth and what you are allowed to want that were handed to you before you were old enough to question them. That material is what is dying, and its death, however disorienting, is not a loss in the deepest sense. The contemplative traditions are unanimous on this point. What feels like the end is a threshold. The dark night does not conclude in emptiness. It concludes in what John of the Cross called a more naked and direct knowing of the self, one that is no longer mediated by the consolations and performances the previous self depended on. Psychologically, Hollis describes the invitation of the second half of life as the task of finding out who you actually are when the provisional self is no longer sufficient, not with nostalgia for the self that was, but with honest curiosity about the self that is trying to emerge. The twin flame separation is painful in the way that all genuine thresholds are painful, not because something is going wrong, but because something is being asked of you that the self you arrived with does not yet know how to give. What is being asked is not endurance. Endurance alone passes through the experience without learning from it. What is being asked is presence inside the dissolution, the willingness to sit with the question of who you are when the familiar markers of yourself are no longer fully available. That is not comfortable, but it is, in the most precise sense, the point. Come back to the body now. Notice the quality of your own presence in this moment, not your feelings about the connection, not the story, just the sensation of being here, in this body, in this particular moment of your life, on the other side of something that has changed you in ways you may not yet be able to fully articulate. There is a self here that is different from the self that entered this connection. It may feel less certain, less defended, less clear about what it knows and what it wants and what it can rely on. That is not damage. That is porousness. And porousness, in contemplative psychology, is not weakness. It is the condition under which genuine contact with the deeper self becomes possible. The mystics who mapped this territory were not describing an exception. They were describing something they recognized as a fundamental feature of genuine interior development. The self must be disturbed at depth before it can grow at depth. And the disturbance, the specific quality of being undone by something that refused to resolve itself into the ordinary, is not an accident of the twin flame connection. It is perhaps its most precise gift, not the return of the person, not the resolution of the longing, but the discovery, slow and often reluctant, of a self that is more honest, more porous, more genuinely its own than the one that arrived at the beginning of this. Who were you before this connection taught you that the self you were living inside had edges that needed to dissolve? And who are you becoming now, in the quiet, in the uncertainty, in the space where the old answers no longer quite hold? Sit with that, not as loss, as the particular, difficult, irreversible grace of being changed by something real.